Hello, everybody. I'm looking at Foundations of Social Theory, and I'm going to walk through Chapter 2, which is on Marx, Karl Marx, class struggle, revolution. My goodness. Um, so the key concepts in this chapter are alienation, class, mode of production, commodity fetishism, and historical materialism. And the textbook does a decent job of explaining those things. And it's exciting and fun for me to finally see a textbook that actually has a positive view of Marx and takes seriously kind of the magnitude of his contribution to society and to sociology. So some quotes from here that stood out to me. The biography of him, Marx lived the tumultuous life of a revolutionary, stirring up trouble across Europe, being kicked out of country after country. So he moved from Germany to France, then Belgium briefly, and then London and England. And he was a political economist. Uh, so some of his concepts, alienation, which I will actually add some slides in our asynchronous activity about because I already have slides created about alienation when I've TA'd for Social 168. But it's this feeling of separation from yourself and the work you're doing, the other people that you're working with, um, and the product of your work too. And Marx is critiquing capitalist production for creating an alienating setup. Whereas if you're kind of your own craftsperson, like your own entrepreneur, your own business, you have a say over what you're doing. You're kind of proud of what you produce, and it's less alienating, or so he says. So also there's different setups of work. Like I would consider the type of work I do at UCR, luckily, to be not very alienating because I get to follow kind of what I'm passionate about and study things, teach things that I feel connected to, and the people that I'm working with. I try to, you know, see their full humanity and interact myself as a human with everybody else. Class is the next concept, and it's the most strongly associated with Marx and something that we really can use every day in our world and thank Marx for the way that he distinguishes between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, or the working class and the ownership class. So in Marx's uh, theory of surplus value, there's this exploitative relationship where the workers at a capitalist enterprise are being more productive than just what they're being paid for, and that surplus value goes to the capitalist either to reinvest in their business where they hired workers or to reinvest in their own private endeavors for fun and for wealth accumulation. So the book on page 18 gives you a pretty good like mathematical outline of surplus value and kind of how that works. I think that's useful to read and look through. But a quote here about Marx and class, it's less set in stone than maybe people might assume. Crucially, for Marx, class relations are always open to change. A key concept here is class consciousness. If the working class realizes, so there's an additional concept here. It's not listed in the beginning of the book or the beginning of the chapter. Right, so it's just under the umbrella of class, but class consciousness is its own concept. Uh, if the working class realizes what it has in common, that it is an exploited majority, they can come together and change the social structure, reconfigure class relations, and bring forth a new mode of production. The problem is that the workers do not have class consciousness, but instead suffer from false consciousness. This is an important reason for why no revolution has happened and why capitalism, for now, remains for Marxists. Sorry, and why no revolution has happened and why capitalism, for now, remains. Everything I'm saying is echoing in my ear. For Marxists, this is due to the fact that most people in society have been tricked into accepting their economic conditions and believing that the social world exists as it does for their own benefit. Marxists would argue that liberal theories such as trickle-down economics, where everyone is meant to benefit from the rich getting richer, are powerful falsehoods which encourage conformity and which reduce the possibilities for revolution. For Marx, for society to change, the working class needs to shed its false consciousness to realize the lies of capitalism and attain class consciousness. This would lay the foundations for the working class to come together and bring forth a fairer and more rationally organized society. So, the author of the textbook, Neil Harris, is kind of making some assumptions here a little bit. Fairer, I think we can all jump on board with that a little bit, even though it is a bit of a leap of faith. But then more rationally organized society, rationality can only be employed on the behalf of any kind of value or end goal. So if you're rationally pursuing a society that maximizes the amount of macaroni and cheese that gets produced and consumed, you'd follow certain rational steps to do that. Capitalist society operates perfectly rationally for accumulating surplus value in the hands of owners of capital. It's just that if people want to pursue the value of fairness, equity, and equality in society, then, or fairness, equity, and equality of opportunity in society, then capitalism is not rational. So he's kind of not listing his assumption that like he values fairness. And then also this paragraph will hint to Gramsci, who we're going to read about later in this textbook, in terms of kind of cultural hegemony and critical theory also builds off of Gramsci in that regard, in terms of people kind of buying into capitalism, even if it doesn't directly benefit them or it doesn't benefit them as much as some alternatives that are more fair. And also it's kind of from our vantage point nowadays, we should try to view these kinds of opinions of capitalism or Marxism as kind of extremes that we can kind of sift through and shop around from. So there might be some contexts where we personally would choose, okay, I would support more of a public institution that just kind of mechanically divides resources in a way that's more fair. And then there might be other contexts where we want there to still be kind of the owner and worker relationship, and we want inequality because it's some kind of reward for people who get to own things. I think it's pretty safe to say that most of us would enjoy better public things that are just more fairly distributed. And we would agree with Marx in that regard. But yeah, another reason why we haven't had uh, a successful global revolution to kind of turn the page from capitalism is that there's a lot of power in the hands of capitalists, and they will invest resources in maintaining that power. So it's a tough task. And then even if certain people get their power kind of taken out from them, then how does it automatically get distributed fairly and equally? So it's a big challenge, and Marx is better at identifying the problems with capitalism than perfectly painting a picture of what could happen instead of capitalism. What we can take in this day and age is bite-sized bits of Marxism and implement that in the organizations that we work with to make them run more democratically, or in our localities to have more public goods, make more public parks, make more resources available to everybody. So it doesn't need to be something that we just follow fundamentally, but we get this perspective and this sociological theory of a critique of capitalism and some of these ideas like class consciousness or false consciousness, which we can use to apply to the world we live in without even trying to do some kind of big bloody revolution. On the next page, page 20, under commodity fetishism, Marx argued that in reality, capitalism is a social relation mediated by things. So capitalism is this social relation comparing different levels of power between people. And it's like the commodities that we have access to or that we have ownership of kind of is this way of mediating the social relations within capitalism. So when we learn about living in a consumer society, that'll you'll see the legacy of Marxism in that. Um, and then historical materialism. Marx's approach to theorizing society was based on his critical reading of the German philosopher Hegel. Hegel's work was extremely rich conceptually, but very hard to engage with. Hegel was interested in how societies evolved and how people's ideas developed. For Hegel, these two concerns are closely related. Hegel held that there was a spirit, Geist, which permeates the world, which echoes throughout social institutions and which shapes people's consciousness. Precisely what Hegel meant by Geist is much debated. It is a tricky idea to understand. It is perhaps easiest to think of it as a sort of social mind, a form of thinking which permeates social organization and people's consciousness. For Hegel, Geist is always in motion, always developing. It was always constantly changing and becoming more coherent over time. And we learn uh, of Hegel's dialectics, which is like change happening in spirals where there's tensions. It's like a parking garage where you're going up to different levels in the floor, and each level is like a new tension. And when one tension wins out over the other, that struggle is kind of like going in a little loop, and then one side wins out, and all of a sudden you're on the next floor of the parking garage, and then there's some kind of new tension. And for Marx, that tension was between workers and owners. However, we can think dialectically about sorts of change where that tension, we see the toppling, the changing of the floors in the parking garage a lot more frequently, because that tension between workers and owners is still kind of wobbling around. It's tough to say that workers have any big solid win in our society, but we do have labor unions. We do have the weekend. We have gotten rid of child labor in most instances. So there are some worker protections. It's not just pure bloody capitalism and nothing else in our world that we run by. It's kind of a mixture of both capitalism and the alternatives to it. However, those alternatives are not as well developed as, yeah, about as they could be. He's telling me to move on. Okay. And then kind of they're talking about Marx shaping social theory as it's kind of this revolution, historical materialism being this big idea that people can glom onto and think, okay, like people's material conditions, like the comforts we enjoy with life, like that's a really observable thing that we can measure, we can study as social scientists and be like, okay, how many people have a car? How many people own their own house? We can look at these economic measures as outcomes and then trace the social roots of whether or not people have those outcomes. And sometimes it's really fuzzy qualitative stuff like, okay, these people weren't interested in buying a car. Why or why not? And sometimes it's just these like physical necessities where it's like, okay, people's workplaces are 10 miles away from where they live. There's not a train track, there's not a shuttle, there's not a reliable bus system. So they either need to like hitchhike or drive their own car or carpool or figure out a way to get to work. So we see these material constraints shaping our lives and shaping the reality in terms of social class that we enjoy. And social class, Marx looked at as kind of just black and white between workers and owners, but in the world that we live in, it's kind of this spectrum where even people who are working class might own a tiny little sliver of a share of a stock if they want to invest in something with some of their extra money from their paycheck, even if they're in debt. A lot of people own stocks, but also are in debt because they're borrowing money for their education or borrowing money to buy a car, borrowing money because they got sick and had a big medical bill, or of course, borrowing money because they bought a house. And that's what most homeowners in America do is get a mortgage. Um, and this is an interesting part, page 27, talking about class reductionism. So Marx is often critiqued for just focusing on class and not giving enough attention to race or gender in terms of kind of like a big dividing line. Like W.E.B. Du Bois, who we learned about on July 30th, said that the problem of the 1900s, the 20th century, is the problem of the color lines, basically saying that race is the biggest social division, at least in America. Um, but maybe around the globe too. I don't know if he was specific about America or not. Um, but the author Neil Harris of the textbook here says that for people who really like Marx, they could just say, hey, actually, class is that big fundamental thing that the difference between, even if you are a racial minority and you're discriminated against or treated rudely in some ways because of your race, and that's really a problem that ought to be solved itself, that the difference between people who are discriminated against on their race and people of that same race who don't get quite as much discrimination can be traced along class lines. And there has been a lot of research kind of supporting that, like sociologist William Julius Wilson, um, who studied the difference between African Americans of different class statuses, or people with different education levels, people with different levels of money in their bank account, homeowners versus not homeowners. And he showed that racial discrimination is worse when you're poor. And that when you're rich, you can kind of eliminate a lot of the pains and the worst parts of racial discrimination. So Marxism is still kind of relevant, even when you add the race layer or the gender layer too. Another response is to reject the primacy of class and to suggest that all social dynamics are intersectional. So intersectionality is saying we can't really ever purely isolate just class or just race or just gender or something that's all mixed together. And then even still, Marx's insight on class is helpful for that part of the intersection. So yeah, that's the Marx chapter, and it's really fun. The further reading here, like there's a lot of really good stuff that in every chapter that they suggest. It's no joke types of stuff. Like they have Bertell Ollman's book, Dance of the Dialectic, Steps in Marx's Method. Uh, that's a really, really good book about that parking garage dynamic of change happening between tension between two opposing forces and then spiraling upward towards other oppositions when there is one that wins out against others. There's from Southern California, our own local person who taught at UCR back in the day, Mike Davis. Uh, Old Gods, New Enigmas, but he's also just someone who's a great reader of Marx. He was like a uh, he he was just a working class person. I forget what job he had, maybe a truck driver or something, before he became an academic. There's David Harvey's Companion to Marx's Capital, so I'll try to make sure I include some slides linking to David Harvey because that's another good resource. So there's all kinds of really good stuff. And again, the textbook takes a friendly perspective of Marx, and that's pretty in contrast with Durkheim, who Neil Harris describes as kind of sterile and like just like stuffy academic, living a comfortable life economically, but emotionally kind of not living the most happy life, unfortunately. But he studies some of these things that uh, are social structures affecting people's personal, not so great feelings. So feelings like anomie, that's something you feel as an individual, but this normlessness of a society, not really feeling tethered to anything meaningful. Uh, Anomie is a great concept from Durkheim that we could tie into the consumer society we live in. Collective consciousness is another really cool idea that is not too different from social structure, but it's more specific because it's thinking of those shared. Let's see what the textbook says explicitly. Durkheim's concept of collective consciousness is closely related to his work on anomie. While anomie refers to the feeling of disconnection from the normative order of society, collective consciousness captures the shared beliefs, customs, attitudes, traditions, as well as the norms that serve to bind individuals together. So, collective consciousness encompasses so much more than just agreeing to a vaguely similar sense of right and wrong as everyone else. It includes this, but pushes more further. While anomie is linked to a lack of normative rootedness, collective consciousness points to everything that binds people together through shared understandings, not just norms. Returning to the example above, education, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Organic and mechanical solidarity. It's worth stressing that there were many different languages in most European countries at this stage. So Durkheim was writing about France in like the 1700s, 1800s, and rapid urbanization was shifting mechanical solidarity, which is like this solidarity rooted in sameness, people feeling tied together because they practice the same practices, speak the same language, share a lot of those traits in their day-to-day lives. Once you go to a city, all of a sudden you're in close proximity to a lot of people who are a bit more different from you because they're coming from different places, maybe speaking different languages. There's a bit of that cultural programming that's not quite the same. And he calls that organic solidarity. So in cities, people can still feel connected to others even if they're different. And it's kind of like this division of labor where people play different roles in society, but it makes for a vibrant community nonetheless. In an organic solidaristic society, there is a greater individualization and a weaker collective consciousness. People have less in common and do not aspire as much for the good of the community, but kind of indirectly, there's still some goods that can come about. Social facts is another concept from Durkheim. I mentioned that when talking about social structure the other day, as it's one of those perspectives feeding into actually just contemporary ideas of culture. Just social facts for Durkheim are ideas that are external to us, but they control us from within because we kind of get trained and socialized into believing them. So, social facts comprise objective, observable realities, typically connected to systems, be they religious, economic, political, or legal. So, you look both ways before crossing the street because of the social facts that like cars know that they're just going to drive on the road. But if you're at a crosswalk, maybe you press that button and walk right out because you believe in the law, you believe in the social fact that cars are legally obligated to stop. Probably good to still look both ways though, because if the car hits you, yeah, sure, it's their fault, but you're the one who's really badly injured. For Durkheim, social facts exist regardless of whether people are aware of them and typically have a profound impact on people's behavior. Whether or not you know about capitalism, it won't stop you being impacted by its laws and logics. And then they talk about functionalism and how Durkheim kind of led, or people read Durkheim and created this school of functionalism. But Durkheim was probably a bit more progressive of a thinker than a lot of the functionalist thinkers. And functionalism became this defense of the status quo, where um, even inequality and injustice was kind of explained as benefiting society because we could see that society could produce such great things. But functionalism is rooted in kind of this mistake of conflating correlation with causation. So just because there is a lot of injustice and just because there also is a lot of great stuff in society, it's not very clear how the injustice brings about the great stuff. It more just straightforward to look at society and be like, hey, there's some great stuff and some not so great stuff, and they're not necessarily inherently tied together unless we can really prove that. And none of the functionalist theories, Talcott Parsons, etc., were really able to prove that. Um, so so Durkheim focusing positivism, like focusing on stuff that you can really pinpoint and look at, a lot of material stuff, laws that are written down, court cases that have dates and labels and all that. So part of this discussion is something I highlighted. The author says, our way of viewing the world and way of reasoning has been shaped so as to see a world of static objects, to be organized and reshaped to enable goals to be achieved. These forms of thought have been fundamentally normalized, and the social researcher cannot simply place them to one side when they go about their work. We have had our consciousness penetrated by capitalist, racist, and patriarchal logics. As such, all social research betrays the dominant power structures at work within society. So just studying society is this kind of way of critiquing power because the best thing for someone exploiting someone else is for no one to notice it and no one to do anything about it. And they talk about some of the more modern applications, and then the first mention of Zygmunt Bauman in the textbook. So secondary texts, Jeffrey Alexander and Philip Smith, The Cambridge Companion to Durkheim, one of the few anthologies focusing solely on Durkheim, includes an important contribution from Zygmunt Bauman, Durkheim Society Revisited. So I starred that because I want to check that out, because Zygmunt, of course, is my very fave. And now Bao's up here saying, I think we're done with this mini lecture, right, Bao? Yeah. Yeah. That's all for now. I'll try to add some more slides for Tuesday, and the asynchronous activities already kind of set, but I just wanted to supplement that by giving my thoughts on Marx and Durkheim really quickly, um, just so there's stuff to look through. And otherwise, hope you're having a good Tuesday. Thank you for watching.